And joining us now on the debate in Norfolk, Virginia, Robert Killebrew, Colonel, retired U.S. Army. In Vancouver, British Columbia, Michael Byers, the Research Chair in International Law and Politics at the University of British Columbia. In the nation's capital, Roland Paris, the Research Chair in International Security and Governance at the University of Ottawa. And also in Ottawa, we're delighted to welcome back Omar Samad, Afghanistan's ambassador to Canada. And as soon as the words were out of my mouth, I don't want to give the impression that we're not delighted to have all four of you back, because actually this is a return engagement for the other three of you as well, but I know the other three will understand if I give Mr. Ambassador a bit of an extra plug. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here tonight. I want to start by just reading an editorial that was in the Toronto Star last week regarding talking to the Taliban. It goes like this. As for talking to the Taliban, not so fast. First, the Taliban are not of a mind to negotiate because they are hardly of one mind. They are nowadays a loose coalition of tribal fighters, highway bandits, Islamist mujahideen, and al-Qaeda partisans. Second, even if the Taliban were chanting from the same prayer book as before, negotiation was never their forte, nor mutual tolerance a ready tactic. I do want to get into some discussion about the appropriateness of negotiating with the Taliban, but just before we do that, let us first be clear on what it is that the West actually wants as a political settlement in Afghanistan. And to that end, Colonel Killebrew, let me go to you first. What's the political outcome the West is actually seeking in Afghanistan?
I think what we'd like to have is a stable Afghanistan with a reasonably democratic country, one that safeguards the rights of all Afghani people, and that is secure within its boundaries. That's what we want for any country, and that's certainly, I think, what the Afghani people want. I'd defer to Mr. Ambassador for the final say on that, though. Ambassador
Samad, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, thank you. Absolutely, I think that stability and security are paramount on the minds of Afghans, as we just saw in a survey that came out by the Asia Foundation this week. Development and a better life for their children and for themselves, of course, moving away from the poppy crop to other legitimate crops, and an end to the threats that exist in Afghanistan with the help of the international community. I think that these are what the Afghans are looking for, and we are aiming to live in a more stable region, because Afghanistan's problems, some of our problems, stem from the region itself.
Michael Byers, you take issue with anything you've heard so far?
Well, I think the minimal that we're looking for in Afghanistan is the prevention of that country being used as a base for the kind of overseas terrorist attacks that we saw on September 11th, 2001. That is the minimum. Beyond that, I think we're getting to the point where many NATO countries are simply looking for a graceful way to withdraw. And so if we can minimize that overseas terrorist threat and pull out without any further losses of our soldiers or further billions of dollars of costs, that would become very attractive to many NATO countries.
Roland Paris, your turn.
Well, I agree with the first part of what Michael Byers said, that our minimal objective certainly is to create a basic stability in Afghanistan where the government of Afghanistan is capable of maintaining a reasonable degree of security over most of its territory, so that territory can't be used as a base for outside operations. But where I would disagree with where I think that Michael Byers was going was with his suggestion that goal can be achieved by NATO disengaging from Afghanistan. It strikes me that we've seen what happens when there are vacuums in Afghanistan. I think it would likely be a case of renewed civil war and potentially a repeat of what we saw in the 1990s.
Michael, you want to go back at that?
Well, yes, I think we need to be looking for an alternative approach to the current counterinsurgency focused mission that NATO is engaged in. And I'm looking forward to seeing the next President of the United States leading a strategic review that might, for instance, see a substantial role accorded to the United Nations rather than to NATO to provide that minimal security role.
Okay, we've had a number of items put on the table in terms of what the West wants. Let's look at the other side, and I want to get a better sense from you all now about what the political outcome is that the Taliban are seeking. Mr. Ambassador, why don't you start us out? What do you think it is that the Taliban actually want at the end of the day?
It depends on what group within this so-called umbrella called the Taliban we're talking about. I think that earlier there was an allusion to all these different factions within the Taliban. Now, the Taliban, who are driven by ideology and have connections to international terrorism and Al-Qaeda and the likes, they would like to impose very strict Sharia rule on Afghanistan and rule Afghanistan as they did back in the late 1990s until 2001. And also they don't mind having all kinds of extremists and jihadists join them in that adventure. There are others who are maybe dissatisfied by how certain things have been run or mismanaged, and they would like to see some change, and maybe they can be brought to the table and engaged. And that's what we're looking at right now. I think that the Taliban are not, don't have a unified command, which makes it much more difficult to deal with, and that their purpose is also somewhat dispersed and not unified.
Well, let me follow up with Colonel Killebrew, particularly on that issue of the table that you just raised. Colonel Killebrew, which statement that I'm about to make comes, in your view, closer to what the Taliban actually want? Do they want to regain political and military control of the entire country? Do they want to be satisfied with a seat, quote unquote, at the table? Which is it?
It'd be hard to say unless I sat down with the Taliban, but let me take your question a different direction. The paper, the editorial you read to us was exactly correct. The Taliban actually are not a unified group. They're a fractious collection of tribesmen overlaid with varying degrees of intensity by a religious ideology. They have never been unified. They have always fought. They come from a part of the country, a part of the world, the Pashtun tribes, that is famous for fighting each other and invaders. And I think the opening of negotiations is a very, very hopeful thing, because we're going to be able to split, I think, groups away from the Taliban once we've decided on what their particular agenda is. But I would add one thing. We aren't going to get to that negotiation unless we fight. The history of these tribes, and I look for the ambassador's confirmation on this, the history of these tribes is they only respect you if you can defeat them. And once you've started to defeat them on the battlefield, they're willing to come to you because you've proven yourself to be the stronger tribe.
Well, the question is, can they be defeated on the battlefield? So far, we've been there, what, 7, 8 years, and we haven't really shown that we can yet. Well,
on the individual battles, and I know we're coming to the question of winning battles and losing wars, but on individual battles, we are actually knocking them back very substantially every time they come up. The question for the Taliban is, and the question for us, is they think that we will now, after our election and after NATO goes through its reassessment, that we will start to withdraw. That's the history of every invading force that's ever been in Afghanistan that they've fought. And I personally believe that if we continue to show resolution for another year or so, we'll start to see something come out of negotiations, not with the unified Taliban, but with the various tribes that just decide they're tired of fighting.
Michael Byers, what's your view on that?
Well, I'm glad that people are at least in agreement that negotiations with some elements of the insurgency, with some elements of the Taliban, are now needed. As to whether or not there's any prospect for success on the negotiations is another question, but let's at least give it a try. And let's also realize that the security situation overall is becoming much more worse fairly quickly. And there is a law of diminishing returns that now seems to apply in Afghanistan. Indeed, I think we're now at the point where adding more Western soldiers may only make the situation worse, that we've generated such animosity by being there, at least by being there with this particular forward-leaning approach.
Roland Paris, can we have progress can we have progress diplomatically if we're not doing it at the point of the gun, as Colonel Killebrew has suggested?
I wouldn't characterize it as at the point of a gun, but I think that the Colonel is onto something. If you look back at the history of negotiated settlements of insurgencies and civil wars, the most likely moment for a successful negotiation to occur is when both sides believe that they fought each other to a stalemate. I think it absolutely makes sense to be speaking and making approaches to the different elements of the Taliban. Even the U.S. Secretary of Defense acknowledges that to resolve such conflicts, you have to speak to your enemies. But the situation is such that I think that it's reasonable that some Taliban groups think that they have the upper hand right now, that this is a moment to press their advantage. And so perceptions of weakness or perceptions of trends and gain on the part of the Taliban might very well embolden them and reduce their incentive to come to the negotiating table. That's what the history shows.
Let me get the ambassador beside you to weigh in on that as well.
You know, let's be realistic about what we are facing here. We are facing some armed groups who are fighting us and NATO and all our friends in Afghanistan because they have some connection to regional powers and they are a proxy force for regional powers. And that aspect that modality has to change. Then there are those who are affiliated very strongly with Al-Qaeda and terrorist networks, and that will be the toughest nut to crack. And I think that those are the people with whom we will not negotiate, and there is no room for negotiations with people who have the blood of thousands of innocent Afghans and others on their hands and who are part and continue to be part of terrorist organizations. Then there are those who are there for the money, for economic reasons. And I think that they are probably the ones with whom we would like to explore the possibilities of addressing their needs and their grievances. So we have a diverse group of and set of issues and conditions that are complex. And when we talk about negotiations, the first instance is to first of all recognize who we are talking with and what their purpose is and what their agenda is and how we can come to an agreement, knowing that there are some red lines on our side. On our side, I'm very clear, is the Afghan side, because the Afghan people are a very important element of all of this, because the Taliban are a minority group within Afghanistan, and they represent a minority interest group within Afghanistan, a very brutal one.
Let me try this on with Michael Byers. I think all of our viewers will remember the destruction of the Buddhist statues in Bamyan that the Taliban were responsible for. And we also remember at the time that there were many Muslim scholars from Saudi Arabia and Iran and Pakistan that tried to reason, if you like, with the Taliban not to do that, and they did it anyway. Now, if those groups, who theoretically are more aligned and more simpatico with the Taliban, could not be persuasive, even with NATO's and the United States' military might, and Canada's military might, you know, what chances do we have of persuading them to our view?
Well, first of all, I have no sympathy for the Taliban, and I'm not naive about the prospects, but we have to try. This is a particularly opportune moment to try. Winter is descending upon the mountains of southern Afghanistan. The fighting is likely to die down over the months ahead. We have a new president coming into power in the United States with an election next week and then the actual inauguration in January. It's a good time to explore the possibility to establish whether or not there are elements of the insurgency of the Taliban with whom we can negotiate and to prepare the ground for the kind of a serious strategic review that is almost inevitable in February and March of next year as the new president and his advisors and indeed all of his NATO allies come together with the government of Afghanistan to try to chart a new course. Let's not rule anything out at the moment. What we do know is that with our current counterinsurgency approach, just putting more troops and more guns into southern Afghanistan, that we're digging ourselves into a hole. It's time to try something else. And there could not be a better time with a new president, a new administration on the way in Washington.
Okay, all of that having been said, Colonel Killebrew, let me go to you on this one. Two rather important military people, the British Brigadier Mark Carleton Smith and the U.S. Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Michael Mullen have both warned that we're not winning this war and that time is running out. Is it possible the West is going to lose this thing?
No. Let me just briefly address three things, one of which the ambassador said a second ago that's very important. Taliban, a portion of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, represent really brutal people, and many of them are foreigners in Afghanistan, just like we're foreigners in Afghanistan. The record on Al-Qaeda and the record on the Taliban is that they have their hardcore elements that always overstep and turn the people against them, and as they did in Iraq, as they've done in other places. So eventually the hardcore that we're not going to be able to negotiate with will probably make it impossible for them to win. Second, we haven't done a good job with counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. The fundamental rule of counterinsurgency is that outside powers cannot win counterinsurgency. The people themselves in the country have to win it. The Afghan army has been neglected in our counterinsurgency efforts. It's starting to be rebuilt now. I talked to a general officer today who just came back. He says that it's almost shameful how we have neglected the real counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan. And I assume as Dave Petraeus takes over there that he's going to be moving to that very shortly. In fact, I'm sure of it. So you're going to see, I think, a reborn counterinsurgency effort focusing on rebuilding the Afghan army. And the last point I would make is that the Afghan people themselves are going to decide the outcome of this, not NATO, not the United States, not the Taliban, not Pakistan. The Afghan people, if they support it and we support them correctly, I'm confident of the outcome, at least to the point that we get to a reasonably low level of violence among the Pashtun tribes, which is about where they've been for the past 2,000 years.
Well, let's move our discussion to some consideration of whether or not we need a new strategy over there. And to that effort, let me read an excerpt from this month's Atlantic Monthly magazine. Simply put, the magazine says, an officer corps that a decade ago took its intellectual cues from General Colin Powell now increasingly identifies itself with the views of General David Petraeus. In the 1990s, the Powell Doctrine, with its emphasis on overwhelming force, assumed that future American wars would be brief, decisive, and infrequent. According to the emerging Petraeus Doctrine, the Army, like it or not, is entering an era in which armed conflict will be protracted, ambiguous, and continuous, with the application of force becoming a lesser part of the soldier's repertoire. We have seen that in the U.S. election campaign, John McCain wants 15,000 more troops into Afghanistan. Barack Obama has talked about 10,000 more troops. The commanders on the ground have talked about 20,000 more troops. Roland Paris, would any of that make a difference in your view?
Additional troops by themselves are not going to do that much, in my view. I think that the beginning part of your question really hit the nail on the head, which is reconsidering the strategy. And this is something that people have been calling for years. The U.S. administration has not been paying high-level, close attention to Afghanistan. It's been distracted by Iraq, and it's only very recently that it has come to the realization that there is a downward spiral in Afghanistan. That phrase, downward spiral, is from a draft intelligence report, and it was a phrase that General Petraeus himself used earlier this month. There's a new sense of urgency, and it is prompting a rethinking. It seems to be prompting at least a rethinking of the strategy, which is so badly needed. And General Petraeus is somebody who has demonstrated the ability to think much more broadly about a politically shaped counterinsurgency strategy rather than a purely military one. And this is the kind of thing that he's signaling right now, including the need for negotiation and the need for a broader approach to some of the problems of the region, which are allowing the insurgency to continue.
Michael Byers, they said that the surge is working in Iraq. Would a surge work in Afghanistan?
Well, Iraq and Afghanistan are very different countries. So if the surge is working in Iraq, and there is a question there, it does not necessarily follow that such an approach would work in Afghanistan. In fact, I see some remarkable parallels between the American experience in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and the current situation of NATO in Afghanistan. I think there is a need for a dramatically different approach, one that will involve having foreign forces in Afghanistan. But certainly a renewed emphasis on reconstruction, development, the inauguration of serious negotiations, and as I said earlier, perhaps a change of lead organization from NATO to the UN. But this idea that somehow an additional 10,000 or 15,000 or even 30,000 troops is somehow going to solve the problem is, I think, wrong-headed, because part of the problem is that Afghans are increasingly turning against what they regard as a Western invading force. So if we could get troops from other parts of the world in there with blue helmets, perhaps we could change that dynamic. But our effort currently is not winning hearts and minds, and unless you can win hearts and minds, you will never actually succeed in an effort like this.
Although Michael Byers did raise the issue of a new American president signaling an opportunity for a new approach, a new strategy to Afghanistan. And both of the candidates in this race have talked about the need for many, many, many more troops in the area. Colonel Killebrew, I should ask you then, if there were 10, 15, 20,000 more troops in Afghanistan, would they make a difference to the political goals of the West?
Well, I think so. I think the last speaker was disconnected from reality. In fact, more troops will matter. But more troops will give you a tactical advantage, but not the strategic advantage. The strategic advantage is to rebuild the Afghan army, rebuild to the extent that we can the Afghan political institutions with the ambassador's help and other Afghan political leaders, and start to defeat the Taliban on the battlefield with Afghan troops. When that happens, we'll have a real basis for negotiation. The fact is, to make the Taliban come to the table, whichever faction of the Taliban you're talking about, we have to score battlefield victories that cause them to realize they are not going to prevail by arms. Right now, we're not doing that very well. We're winning the tactical fights, but we're not doing very well across the whole country. And when we can do that, and when we can do it with Afghan troops, the ground will be prepared for negotiations. And I might add, I know that Petraeus is thinking about this and planning to do it. This is not a strategic change of thought. It's simply a resourcing problem we have not been able to address before because we were preoccupied with Iraq.
I do want to hear the ambassador on this, but I think I owe Michael Byers an opportunity to make the case that he is in fact in touch with reality. And therefore, Michael Byers, why don't you take the mic right now and retort, if you care to, the Colonel's assertion.
What I've just heard is a clever argument aimed at postponing the risk of negotiations, which might somehow undermine the desire to see a fully military approach succeed. As for General Petraeus, he's not the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. That role currently falls to President Bush and will fall to a new president come January. And so I'm looking for that strategic review. And if it is Mr. Obama who's the new president, as someone who doesn't have an awful lot of foreign policy experience, he will be totally legitimized by seeking a full strategic review, by seeking input from all of the United States' allies, including Canada. And there's a real opportunity here for Canada to actually play a constructive role in helping to chart a new course, to actually say to President Obama or perhaps President McCain, look, we have a long tradition of doing things a little bit differently. It's called peacekeeping or peacemaking. And let's work with the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping and try a radically different approach that might actually save us all a lot of lives and a lot of money and enable us to extract ourselves from Afghanistan and leave some kind of stability behind.
Okay, let me ask the ambassador. Would you like to see 20,000 more troops, be they NATO, be they Blue Helmets, be they American troops, Canadian troops? Would you like to see them in there?
Well, I'll come to that in a second. I just want to give another reality check to Mr. Byers in terms of the Blue Helmets and the United Nations peacekeeping. Nobody, even in the United Nations, believes that Afghanistan is a Blue Helmet operation. Nobody in the Security Council believes that it's a Blue Helmet operation. This is not a peacekeeping operation in the traditional sense. This is a peace-building and peace-enforcing operation, which requires counterinsurgency, which requires the ANA, the Afghan National Army, and other security forces being shored up and formed in such a way that they could take the lead eventually, yes. It also means development. It also means governance. It also means helping rebuild a state of Afghanistan. Everything that has been destroyed over 30 years of conflict and destruction and invasion and so on and so forth. So it is a very complex operation. It's a mission which the United Nations and in all the countries in the world almost have endorsed, and they agree that this is the way to go. Over time, as we progress, and hopefully it will be progress, we will adjust. We'll have to recalibrate, whether it's the counterinsurgency part or whether it's the development part or other commitments that the international community has made to Afghanistan in order to build an Afghan-style democracy that works for the Afghan people. All of this is part of the mission. And we can't just say that we can only do this and the rest doesn't really matter and then we will leave. That's not how it works. That's not how it has worked in the past. Afghanistan fell into this hole as a result of the international community in disengaging from Afghanistan when it shouldn't have disengaged. And at a time when a vacuum was created, and it was felt by the wrong elements, all these extremists, all these terrorists who now are a threat not only to Afghanistan and to Pakistan, but also to the whole world. So we need to be very, very careful as to how we look at this. So strategy is going to be dynamic. Strategy is going to be reevaluated and reformatted and recalculated and recalibrated as we move on, as we make progress, and sometimes we don't make progress.
Roland Paris, let me try this on with you. The United States, of course, has tried to engage Pakistan in this cause to varying degrees of success. Actually, I think probably most people would say with not much success at all. Is that effort hopeless?
No, I don't think it's hopeless. It's extremely difficult. I would step back and say that the regional dimensions of the Afghanistan conflict, it cannot be ignored because really this is a conflict which is a trans-border conflict with Pakistan. And it's not, the regional dimensions are not just the fact that the insurgents are moving back and forth across the border and that both Afghanistan and Pakistan are threatened with destabilization. The regional dimensions include the relationship between Pakistan and India, which is a tense one, and it's Pakistan's suspicion of India and fear of India and suspicion of what India might or might not be doing in Afghanistan, which is part of the larger complex that makes some elements of the Pakistan government willing to keep supporting the Taliban as an intelligence asset, as a kind of insurance policy against encirclement. So any really comprehensive approach to this conflict is not just going to have to involve the elements that Ambassador Samad mentioned, including governance reform in Afghanistan. It's going to have to crack the very difficult nut of addressing those kind of regional concerns and dimensions, because there's no way this insurgency in Afghanistan is going to end if those safe havens are fully operational in Pakistan.
Michael Byers, you want a word on the Pakistan angle here?
Absolutely. I agree with Roland. Our negotiations have to include negotiations with neighboring states and other regional actors, and there has been an inattention to that diplomatic file over the last couple of years. Negotiating with the insurgency, with elements of the Taliban as part of that larger picture. And as the ambassador said, we do need to recalibrate. But one word of defense in defense of the United Nations. The United Nations has involved itself quite successfully in hundreds of missions over the years, and as we speak right now is actually engaged in active combat in the Congo, attempting to save lives there. Peacekeeping is not for wimps. The United Nations knows what it's doing. Unfortunately, we tend to focus on its failures rather than on its much more considerable successes.
Okay, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left here, and I want to spend some of that time talking about the news that Canada has made on this file. Of course, during the election campaign, Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper, I think, surprised many people by saying that this country would stay until the year 2011, and that was it. And let me read an editorial in the New York Times that speaks to issues around this. Mr. Obama, who may be president by this time next week, or president-elect anyway, said he would withdraw combat forces from Iraq by 2010, shift at least 10,000 more troops to Afghanistan that could be leveraged to persuade NATO allies to also increase their numbers, send more non-military aid to Afghanistan, and build a stronger Afghanistan-Pakistan-NATO partnership on the lawless border. Here's where I want to bring in the PM's angle from here. The PM has decided to leave Afghanistan. Others are talking about putting more troops in. If you were the Taliban, Colonel Killebrew, let me go to you on this. If you were the Taliban watching these mixed messages from the West, what would you make of all this?
Well, I'd be thoroughly confused, just like a lot of us in the West are. I think, first of all, I think the Obama, it's been interesting to watch the Obama position on Iraq and Afghanistan morph through the campaigns. When he started, we were plainly losing in Iraq. Now we're succeeding. In my view, the strategy the New York Times laid out, the Obama strategy, sounds perfectly feasible to me. If I were a Taliban commander in the mountains of Afghanistan, what I would be saying to myself is, oh gee, they're going to pull combat forces out of Iraq and come after me. They're going to build the Afghani army, my brother's an Afghan, even better than it is now. I ought to be looking at my options.
Yeah, but Canada's leaving.
Canada's leaving in 2011. And as I told one of your co-workers earlier today, anytime a politician makes a promise that far out, I have a tendency to discount it. Anything further out than 6 months by a national political leader, is a wish and not an intention.
I'd be curious, Mr. Ambassador, did Prime Minister Harper give you the heads up on that 2011 exit date?
Well, I don't want to discuss any types of official
okay,
bilateral
just between
talks,
us then.
But what I want to tell you as an Afghan is that you know, we are very satisfied with what Canada and all NATO and other countries who are helping us, not only on the security front, but on the development and other humanitarian front, are doing in Afghanistan.
I appreciate that, but
yes.
I do want you to speak to the issue of whether or not you're happy about the fact that Canada intends to leave by July 2011.
Well, the decision by Parliament was to leave Kandahar by 2011, and then, of course, a new announcement was made that that Canada would leave Afghanistan militarily by 2011. Everything else will continue as we see it. Now, between now and then, as the Colonel said, anything could happen. But what is important for us is to make sure that strategically we send the right messages to the Afghan people, to the NATO nations and peoples, and to the Taliban and all those people who are strategizing and planning against us. That is important. I believe that countries have their sovereign rights to decide what is good for them and what is not. And Canada has, as I said, done very well, and we will appreciate this. And we know that Canada will be a friend for a long time to come. But what is very important is to focus on building up the Afghan forces by then, is to make sure that Kandahar at least can stand on its feet, and the people of Kandahar and the Afghan National Army, police, and the government in Kandahar can take care of the affairs of Kandahar.
Roland Paris, we've got less than 3 years, according to the Prime Minister's timetable, to do all of that. Can we do all of that in less than 3 years?
No way. There's no way, in my view, that the ANA is going to be in a condition to be able to secure Kandahar province independently in 2011. The point I think that's important here is that the Prime Minister did adjust his position. The motion in March that was passed in Parliament said that the Kandahar mission would end, and then in September during the election he said that Canadian troops in general would leave Afghanistan. And what that did in effect was, I think, politically neutralize Afghanistan as an issue during the campaign, but it also in some ways jumped ahead of a discussion that we should have and still probably should have about what role, if any, Canada should be playing beyond 2011. I think that there are other possible roles that we could play even militarily, whether it's on the training side, whether it's security in other areas. It did make sense to declare that our military deployment would end in Kandahar in 2011. We don't own Kandahar. By that time, we will have been there for a long time. Somebody else can do it. But I think there's still a discussion to be had about what role we will have, if any, past 2011.
Michael Byers, as you weigh in on this, I want to remind all of our viewers that, of course, you ran for the New Democratic Party in the last election, and I'd be curious as to your view of the new timetable put down by Stephen Harper and whether or not you think we can achieve all of what we need to achieve in the less than 3 years remaining till that target deadline.
Well, I don't have a lot of faith in Stephen Harper's fixed dates. Which is why we had an election in September instead of October 2009.
I thought you were having a little fun with that. Okay.
But in terms of Canada and Kandahar, we have carried a very heavy burden in Kandahar. We've lost almost 100 soldiers. We've had hundreds more who've been very seriously injured. It's cost us somewhere around $10 billion so far. There is no shame in saying that it's time to bring our soldiers home for a little bit of recuperation. Their equipment is wearing out. It's time to bring the soldiers home and rebuild the Canadian forces. NATO is an alliance. There are more than 25 other countries in this coalition who can take on some of the load that Canadian soldiers have carried so successfully, so proudly in terms of their individual efforts to succeed in a mission that I believe was the wrong choice by politicians. But our soldiers are very thinly stretched now. They're worn out. They're tired. It's time to bring them home. And if the United States wants to put 10,000 more troops into Afghanistan to relieve the Canadians, well, you know, from a purely selfish perspective, if that gives us more of an opportunity to withdraw, maybe that's a good thing.
I'm going to give the last word tonight to our American friend who's going to tell us what he thinks about Canada's commitment to Afghanistan and how we've done on the mission there so far.
Well, I don't think it's I don't think it's quite appropriate for me to talk about how well Canada's done. I'll tell you that all of my friends who have served next to Canadian forces in Afghanistan are united in their admiration for the courage, the stamina, and the resourcefulness of the Canadian forces over there. Canada's soldiers have played a wonderful role. They're going to continue to play a decisive and wonderful role. They're not tired and discouraged. They are tough, seasoned, proud fighting men and women doing the job over there for their country they were given to do. And I think Canada, all Canadians, should be proud of the laurels they've added to the history of the Canadian Armed Forces.
And what's your view of the fact that the Prime Minister has now said we're out in less than 3 years?
Well, I think we'll see what happens in 3 years. I think if actually he withdraws Canadian forces after 3 years, Canada has done its share and more than its share. And the United States, NATO, and the Western world can't ask for much more.
You couldn't see Colonel Killebrew because you don't have a monitor in front of you, but Michael Byers was nodding his head at that. We have found something upon which the two of you agree. It took us 36 minutes of discussion, but we eventually got there. Can I thank Robert Killebrew, the retired colonel from the U.S. Army down in Battleground, Virginia. You're going to have an interesting night next Tuesday. Michael Byers on the line from Vancouver, BC. Roland Paris, the professor at the University of Ottawa, and Omar Samad, Afghanistan's ambassador to Canada. Thanks so much, everybody, for a most engaging discussion tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.